Hey everybody, it's Matt here with Piano Blog. This is the first of what I think is going to be a three-part video series, maybe more, maybe less, on some of the principles of piano technique. So I know a lot of you have watched some of my videos on specifics of piano technique and in particular movement patterns associated with piano technique. But what I want to talk about here is something a little more abstract, and I'm going to try and make it useful even though it can be a little bit difficult to make something this abstract useful, and that is how to approach a technical problem. So if you're practicing how to take a technical problem and break it down and make it into something that you can approach without feeling overwhelmed and without just feeling like you're kind of butting your head up against a wall. So I want to give you a little bit of context, but first let me just outline what I think of as the three-part process of doing this, and then I'll give you a little bit of context, and then we'll spend most of our time today talking about the first part of that process. So the three-part process is really simple and almost so broad as to be vague, but it is first to be very specific in identifying the problem, very, very specific. Second, to figure out what movement pattern is most helpful and most comfortable in tackling that problem and playing, say, a particular passage. And third, to drill that movement pattern until it becomes ingrained, and in some cases go back and fix the movement pattern or change it once you figure out that maybe that wasn't the most helpful thing. So it's a little bit of a cyclical process, and what I've presented is something that's really quite simple, or a simplified version, but you'll find it helpful to keep those three broad stages in mind. And today we're going to talk about the first, which is identifying a very specific thing, and we'll talk about how that's helpful. But first, let me give you a little bit of context. There are many different ways to think about piano technique and a lot of different schools of thought. So I'm going to give you something that's pretty oversimplified here, but I want to give you a spectrum of piano technique, and you've maybe encountered this a little bit without realizing it in your studies, depending on how advanced you are. There tend to be two really polar opposite ends of thought, polar camps. One camp is sort of the old school camp of we're going to drill everything as much as possible. So this is, people who give a lot of Czerny exercises, Hanon exercises, hours of scales and arpeggios and things like that every day. And the idea being, if you just kind of drill this, you'll reach a point where you become fluent at it, and then you can apply that to your playing. And you especially encounter this if you go and read some accounts of how people used to practice, or especially people who studied with big name teachers used to practice. I mean, it was kind of amazing, and still is to this day. But go back and read someone like Liszt, who practiced by his own account several hours of scales and technique every day. Or go ahead and read, say, Czerny's advice to people on how much his exercises ought to be practiced. It's kind of astounding, at least to some of our modern tastes, to hear that you might sit down to practice your scales for at least 2 hours every day or something like that. It just seems like, wow, that's quite a lot of time to devote to technique. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum is what's probably a more recent phenomenon, which is the idea that stuff should really kind of mostly be thrown out the window, and we should focus more on understanding movement patterns, understanding the motor patterns that underlie playing, that underlie specific technical problems, and then apply those to technique. And so at the very, very far end of that spectrum, there's people who suggest not practicing any exercises at all. And so famously, you'll hear people like Richter, the great pianist, saying, "I never practiced scales." You'll read accounts of people like Godowsky, people saying he couldn't play a scale evenly, even though he was one of the great technicians of his age. So there does seem to be some truth to the idea that all of these exercises and technical patterns and this hours of kind of rote practice aren't necessary for having a great piano technique. And of course, there's a middle ground, and there's all sorts of different versions of technical camps and what you might hear suggested. And then there's a million different versions of specifics of how you might approach a specific technical problem, such as octaves or five-finger patterns or whatever. But I think most people can agree, or at least I believe, that it's really a mixture of both. You have to understand what the specific technical problem is in terms of how to approach it correctly with your movement patterns. So for instance, you have to understand the underlying movement patterns to play a fluent scale, but then there's a lot of drilling involved to make that automatic. And those of you who are students of my online courses and things like this know that I tend to focus more on the underlying movement patterns, just because in many cases the drilling involved is very close to the goal, to the problem. So for example, the drilling of practicing, of having good scales is to practice your scales. So that tends not to be an issue for people. Sometimes there are exercises that people might not have thought of that are helpful, but in many cases the problem, the technique that you're trying to solve is very similar to the exercise you would use to solve it. But the motor patterns are usually more of a mystery for people, which is why in a lot of my courses I concentrate more on the patterns, on the movements that you might use to understand how to practice these sort of things. But both are really important in my view. You have to put in quite a lot of work and quite a lot of drilling, but you have to also understand what movement patterns underlie that so that you're practicing the right thing over and over again. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've seen people and students practice things like scales or arpeggios with incorrect movement patterns, and up to a certain point it works because the body tends to adapt and figure out what works best. But then very often, unless they're lucky enough to fall into a good movement pattern, they hit a ceiling because what worked up to a certain point suddenly wouldn't work. So for example, very, very often you'll see people who can play at a slow speed something like a 5-finger pattern. And I'm doing this incorrectly. I don't know if you can see from this angle, but those of you who have studied some of my videos and writing know that I'm very much a proponent of aligning the hand as you come up. So you can get away though with a slow 5-finger pattern without aligning the hand correctly as you come up. But as you go faster and faster, what you start to find is that especially fingers 3, 4, and 5, if you're not learning how to correctly align the hand, feel very weak and very cramped. And that's something that might not show up until you've studied piano for a year or so. And so if you haven't taken the time to study and understand the correct motor patterns there, you're really ingraining something that isn't helpful. And by the time you realize it's not helpful, you then have to do all the work to go back and fix it, which can take, it can take quite a lot of effort and frustration, and some people actually give up. But I hope you don't. But that's the importance of really understanding the motor pattern while you're drilling. So that's all some context about a little bit of the history of piano technique. I mean, really small little bit of it, and understanding some of the different camps involved and what you might encounter when you're practicing technique or when you're listening to one person talk about technique versus listening to another. It's helpful to know that there are kind of these different schools of thought, and then a myriad of very specific schools of thought. So let's get into these steps that I talked about earlier about how to approach a technical problem. And I wanted to talk about the first step, which is identifying in very exact terms the technical problem. And this might seem obvious to people, but I see over and over again that most people, when they practice technique, never really take the time to do this first step, and because of that, they're held back and they can never quite figure out what's going on. So I want to give you an example of this. I'm just going to kind of make one up. I'm going to pretend that we have an issue doing a jump. So for instance, I'm going to jump an octave C up to another octave C here, and I'm going to try my best not to be able to do it, although this is something that's pretty ingrained as a good habit for me. But I'll try my best to screw it up just to give you a sense of what I encounter a lot of times when I'm practicing jumps. So here we go. Here's octave C screwing up and not hitting the next octave. So I'm hitting a B, and I really want to hit a C here, but I'm hitting a B, intentionally messing up. So here's a vague way to define this. The vague way is, I can't play this jump. It's a very vague thing. I can't play the jump. It's very obvious. I'm trying to get from C to C, and instead I'm hitting B or whatever, wherever my hand ends up. That's a vague way of putting it. Here's a specific way of putting the problem. I want you to see the difference. The specific way is, as I move my hand up from this first C, I'm not landing in a good position to play the second C, and then I miss a note. Now that might seem like it's the same thing. I'm saying, oh, I'm just not hitting the second C. But it's very different, because in the second instance, I'm actually identifying what the problem is, or I'm doing my best to identify what the problem is. I'm being very, very specific in terms of how my hand position is affecting the playing of the second octave. So listen again to how I describe it. As I move my hand up to play the second octave, it's not getting in position correctly. Why is this important? What I want to show you is the difference in the type of questions and the type of thinking that posing the problem in these two different ways might lead to. So the first way, if I just say, I can't get to the second C, I'm going to do what most people do, what I see most students do when they have problems with something like a jump. And that is, I'm just going to keep repeating the darn thing. And sometimes it might go well, and sometimes it might not go so well. And I'm going to always have a sense of, that octave passage is really hard, and sometimes I get it and sometimes I can't. And what's worse is I'm going to know it's hard, and so if it's in a piece of music as it's coming up, I'm going to start kind of approaching the octave passage, and I'm going to get more and more tense, and then I'm going to probably have even a greater chance of missing it because I'm not quite sure how to handle that technically. Okay, so now the second way, the more specific way of framing this is, I have a problem of playing one octave and then getting my hand in position. So what that allows me to do is I start thinking along the lines of, how can I get my hand in position for the second octave? And I start looking very, very specifically at, what is the movement of my hand from one octave to the next? Now, I'm not suggesting that suddenly you're just going to know what the answer is to this. I mean, there's a lot of technical training. I work with students quite a lot on understanding the correct movement pattern here. But just by starting to look at this, you see I've created a situation where there's a problem to be solved. There's something to be thought about instead of just kind of going over and over and hoping for the best, hoping things go well. So now I can start to think, and I'll kind of fast track this, but this is something that you might start to encounter, if you think about this for a week or so. Now I start to think things like, okay, I have this first octave, and I'm coming off of this, and can I practice getting my hand over the second octave? So I'm not going to play, I'm going to practice getting my hand over the second octave. So for example, like this. This, by the way, is a really excellent way to practice jumps. So I'll throw that in there as a very specific example. So, a very specific piece of advice. So now I'm starting to think, okay, look at the movement of my hand as I come up to that C. And now you see what I'm ingraining as I repeat this and practice this over and over again is not this kind of just repetition and messing up. I'm ingraining the movement from one C to the next. And now, every time I repeat this, I become more and more fluid. It becomes more and more easy and relaxed of emotion, and I feel more and more of a sense of control instead of just this kind of unease and sense of tension. it gets to the point where you can actually do it, and I'll try this on camera, you can actually do it, oops, without looking, because your arm gets a sense of where things are. Of course, you can, it's kind of a little scary, so there's nothing wrong with looking down there. But you see, by practicing that movement, I've ingrained that pattern. So I hope this makes sense. Now it's not just with jumps. This comes into play with all sorts of things. So for instance, if you have a particular piece of passage work, I'll just make something up. Let's say you're doing that, but I'm going here E, G, D, C sharp, E. And let's say I always miss the C sharp. Well, instead of just repeating that over and over again, I can frame the problem as my fourth finger tends to get a little too far to the right instead of over the C sharp when coming from the B. You see, that's a very, very specific way of framing the problem. And then what I do, instead of just repeating it over and over again, is I practice getting to the B, and my fourth finger is over the C sharp, ready to play. You see? And so just by framing the question in that way, by being very specific about what movements and what patterns are at play and where the problem seems to be, that's going to give me a big head start on practicing the right motor pattern. Again, it's a cyclical process, so sometimes you'll think that you have the answer, and then as you practice it you realize, oh wait, you know, I didn't quite ingrain the right movement there, and then you have to go back. But at least here you have some sort of problem that you're trying to solve, instead of just throwing caution to the wind and practicing the same thing over and over again with no real result or no specific motor pattern. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about the next two steps after being very specific, which is kind of understanding the correct motor pattern. And I've talked a little bit about that here, but I'll give more advice on finding the correct motor pattern. And I might include, we'll see how far we get, but I might include the third step in that video as well, which is simply repeating over and over again. That one probably, yeah, I think I have a lot I might be able to say about that, because that's not always as simple as it might seem. So I'll see you in the next video. If you found this helpful and you want more advice on technique or more advice on the piano playing in general, I've included a link below this video for my piano technique course, which is a three-part video series which deals with some more specific topics in piano techniques. It's not as general as what we talked about in this video, but I actually delve into some specific topics. And of course, you can always visit me at pianoblog.com, and there's lots of helpful information there. Thanks for watching.